So, Act 1, Scene 1, then, the beginning of the play, takes place before Leonato's house. And Leonato, Hero, Beatrice, and a messenger enter. And Leonato says, I learn in this letter that Don Pedro of Aragon comes this night to Messina. Essentially meaning, look, I've got a letter here and it's telling me Don Pedro's coming. He's coming here. And the messenger says, he is very near by this. He was not 3 leagues off when I left him. So, meaning he's very near. In fact, he was only about 9 miles away when I left him to bring you this message. Leonato asks, how many gentlemen have you lost in this action? Meaning, how many noblemen died in the battle? So Don Pedro and his men are soldiers. They've been at war. Leonato's saying, look, how many were hurt? And the messenger says, but few of any sort and none of name. Which means, hardly anybody died and nobody important. Leonato says a victory is twice itself when the achiever brings home full numbers. I find here that Don Pedro hath bestowed much honour on a young Florentine called Claudio. So this is an introduction to the character of Claudio. And Leonato says, well, it's a double victory, basically, when you both win the battle and also bring your soldiers home safely. And I can see in this letter that Don Pedro gives a lot of honour to a young man from Florence called Claudio. And the messenger says, much deserved on his part and equally remembered by Don Pedro, he hath borne himself beyond the promise of his age, doing in the figure of a lamb the feats of a lion. He hath indeed better expectation than you must expect of me to tell you. So the messenger says, yes, Claudio, he really deserves it, and Don Pedro has suitably rewarded him. Claudio's been braver than you'd expect from someone of his age. He's like a lamb fighting, but with a lion's courage, and he's done so well, I can't even tell you all the details now. So this sort of establishes the character of Claudio as, somebody who's a good guy, and I'll talk more about the analysis in the next video, but, certainly very positive about Claudio. And Leonato says he hath an uncle here in Messina, will be very much glad of it. So in other words, Claudio's got an uncle in this area who will be very proud and delighted to hear this news. The messenger then says, I've already delivered him letters, and there appears much joy in him, even so much that joy could not show itself modest enough without a badge of bitterness. So this basically means I've given some letters to him, and he was so overjoyed he actually looked as though he was in pain. Leonato says, well, did he break out in tears? Did he start crying? And the messenger says, in great measure, yes, he cried a lot. And Leonato says, a kind overflow of kindness. There are no faces truer than those that are so washed. How much better it is to weep at joy than to joy at weeping. So Leonato is basically saying, this guy was literally overflowing with emotion, and his tears show how much it meant to him, and it's much better for him to cry with joy than to enjoy crying. And then we have the introduction of Beatrice, one of the most fascinating, well-written characters in all of Shakespeare's work. And she says, I pray you, is Signor Montanto returned from the wars or no? Now, this is a sort of a play on words, meaning Mr. Social Climber, somebody who wants to improve himself socially all the time. Has he returned from the battle? Of course, the messenger doesn't know the joke and says, I know none of that name, lady. There was none such in the army of any sort. In other words, I don't know anyone who's called that. There was nobody called Sir Montanto in our army. And Leonato says, what is he that you ask for, niece? Who is it you're talking about? And Hero says, my cousin means Signor Benedick of Padua. In other words, look, who Beatrice is talking about is Benedick from Padua. And the messenger says, oh, he's returned and as pleasant as ever he was. Yes, he's returned and he's as nice as always. And then, of course, Beatrice jumps on that and says, he sets up his bills here in Messina and challenged Cupid at the flight, and my uncle's fool, reading the challenge, subscribed for Cupid, and challenged him at the bird bolt. I pray you, how many hath he killed and eaten in these wars? But how many hath he killed? For indeed I promised to eat all of his killing. So this is where the wordplay gets a bit tricky. But what basically is being said here is Benedick challenged Cupid to an archery contest here in Messina, publicly boasting he could make more women fall in love with him than Cupid's arrows could hit. And my uncle's jester, reading the challenge, accepted on Cupid's behalf, but used blunt arrows, normally used for shooting birds at close range. Tell me, how many men has Benedick killed and eaten in the war? Or more importantly, how many has he killed because I actually promised to eat anyone he killed? So we get a sense that there's a bit of banter, essentially, that Beatrice sort of said to Benedick, look, you're not going to kill anyone in this war. In fact, if you do, I'll eat them. And then Leonato explains, faith, niece, you tax Signor Benedick too much, but he'll meet with you, I doubt it not. So he's sort of saying, good grief, Beatrice, you insulting Sir Benedick too much. But I've got no doubt he'll get even. So Shakespeare's really establishing this sort of verbal battle between the two characters at this point. And Beatrice says, you had musty victual, and he hath holp to eat it. He's a very valiant trencherman, he hath an excellent stomach. So all of this following stuff from Beatrice is basically wordplay, where she's joking, and she's using her words with a double meaning often to be sort of humorous, but basically saying you had rotten food and he helped you eat it. He's a very brave eater with an excellent stomach. The messenger falls into these traps and says things like this, and a good soldier too, lady. And just saying he's a good soldier as well, Beatrice. And Beatrice says, a good soldier to a lady, but what is he to a lord? So she's taking his words and playing on them. Oh yeah, he's a good soldier to a lady, but what is he to a lord? The messenger says, a lord to a lord, a man to a man, stuffed with all honourable virtues. And, essentially, he treats a lord like a lord and a man, and he's full of goodness. He's a good person. And Beatrice says, it is so, indeed, he is no less than a stuffed man, but for the stuffing, well, we are all mortal. In other words, absolutely, he's stuffed like a dummy, but, well, no body is perfect. And then Leonato again has to jump in and explain, you must not, sir, mistake my niece. There is a kind of merry war betwixt Signor Benedick and her. They never meet, but there's a skirmish of wit between them. In other words, look, don't misunderstand, Beatrice. There's an enjoyable banter between Benedick and her, and whenever they meet, they try to outwit each other. And Beatrice says, alas, he gets nothing by that. In our last conflict, 4 of his 5 wits went halting off, and now is the whole man governed with one, so that if he have wit enough to make himself warm, let him bear it for a difference between himself and his horse, for it is all the wealth that he hath left to be known a reasonable creature. Who is his companion now? He hath every month a new sworn brother. So Beatrice launches this tirade, basically. Poor dear, she says, he never wins. In our last clash, he was so confused he wasn't much cleverer than his horse, and all he has in favour is that people think he's reasonable. Who is his best friend now? Every month he has a new best friend. The messenger says, is it possible? He's starting to question Beatrice. Is that actually possible? He has a new best friend every month. And Beatrice says, very easily possible. He wears his faith, but as the fashion of his hat, it ever changes with the new block. In other words, she says, very possible. His loyalty changes as often as the style of his hat. And the messenger finally, works out what's going on here and says, I see, lady, the gentleman's not in your books. In other words, you don't like him, do you? He's not in your good books. And Beatrice says, no, and he were, I would burn my study. But I pray you, who is his companion? Is there no young squarer now that will make a voyage with him to the devil? Basically, no. He's not in my good books, and if he was in my good books, I'd burn all of my books. But who is his best friend? Is there a young warrior who is going to travel with him to hell and back? And the messenger says, well, he is most in the company of the right noble Claudio. So, he mostly hangs about with Claudio, who we just talked about. Now that sets up an interesting thing, because we've already established Claudio's a really good guy. Benedick we're not sure about, but Beatrice certainly doesn't like him, and that's a bit of conflict. O Lord, he will hang upon him like a disease. He is sooner caught than the pestilence, and the taker runs presently mad. God help the noble Claudio. If he have caught the Benedick, it will cost him £1,000 ere he be cured. So Beatrice is distraught at this. O Lord, Benedick will stick to him like a disease. He's an infection more easily caught than the plague, driving those he plagues mad. God help Claudio. If he has caught the Benedick, he's taking on an expensive friend. And the messenger says something which I always like. I will hold friends with you, lady. I'm going to be your mate, he says. He thinks this is a funny woman, full of banter. I want to be friends with her. And Beatrice says, do, good friend. In other words, yeah, let's do it. Add me on Facebook. And Leonato says, you will never run mad, niece. In other words, you're not going to ever fall madly in love, are you? And Beatrice says, no, not till a hot January. So no, not until January becomes a hot month. In other words, never. And then in come the other guys, so Don Pedro, Don John, Claudio, Benedick and Balthasar. Bit of excitement in the audience because we now know, these are the people who were just being talked about, quite a lot of them. And Don Pedro begins, good Signor Leonato, you are come to meet your trouble. The fashion of the world is to avoid cost and you encounter it. So in other words, you're a good guy, Leonato. Most people want to avoid trouble. You know this is going to be costly, our visit to you, but you actually come out and greet my expensive army. And Leonato says, never came trouble to my house in the likeness of your grace. For trouble being gone, comfort should remain. But when you depart from me, sorrow abides and happiness takes his leave. In other words, you're no trouble, your grace. When trouble goes away, it's a relief. But when you leave me, happiness goes away and I'm sad. So in other words, you're very welcome. And Don Pedro says, you embrace your charge too willingly. I think this is your daughter. In other words, you're too willing to be a host. And then he turns to Hero and says, oh, this is your daughter. And Leonato says, her mother hath many times told me so. So in other words, well, her mum's told me that a few times. So a bit of joking again. Nice light-hearted, scene, really. And then the very famous Benedick, who we've just been learning about, says, were you in doubt, sir, that you asked her? So he jumps onto Leonato's joke and says, did you doubt it, sir? Is that why you asked? And Leonato says, Signor Benedick, no, for then were you a child. So in other words, no, Benedick, because you were just a child at that time and you were too young to seduce my wife. So Leonato turns the joke back and saying, I know you could be her dad because you're such a stud, but, you were a kid back then. So no, I know she's my daughter. Don Pedro says, you have it full, Benedick. We may guess by this what you are, being a man. Truly the lady fathers herself. Be happy, lady, for you are like an honourable father. So Don Pedro is basically saying, cut it out, Benedick. Leonato knows your reputation, and truly the lady looks like her father. Be happy, lady, for you resemble an honourable man. And then Benedick says, if Signor Leonato had if Signor Leonato be her father, she would not have his head on her shoulders for all Messina, as like him as she is. So he continues the joke, continues the kind of idea, well, even if Leonato is her dad, she wouldn't want to have his head on her shoulders, even if she is like him. So it goes on. And Beatrice jumps on the fact that, he's continued the joke too long. And says, I wonder that you still be talking, Signor Benedick. Nobody marks you. So in other words, why are you still chatting? No one's actually listening. And Benedick says, one of my favourite lines, what, my dear Lady Disdain, are you yet living? So he's saying, oh, Lady Disdain, are you actually still alive? And Beatrice says, is it possible that Disdain should die while she hath such meat food to feed it as Signor Benedick? Courtesy itself must convert to disdain if you come in her presence. So in other words, how could Disdain die when she's got so much to feed on that is you? Courtesy becomes disdain when you're there. And Benedick says, then is courtesy a turncoat, but it is certain I am loved of all ladies, only you excepted, and I could find in my heart that I had not a hard heart, for truly I love none. So Benedick says, well, courtesy is a traitor then. All women love me except you, and what a shame I'm so hard-hearted that I don't love any of them. But Beatrice jumps on that. A dear happiness to women, they would else have been troubled with a pernicious suitor. I thank God and my cold blood I'm of your humour for that. I had rather hear my dog bark at a crow than a man swears he loves me. So basically, how lucky for women that you don't like them. Now at least they won't be bothered by an idiot like you. I'm as cold-blooded as you are. I would rather hear my dog barking at a crow than hear a man tells me he loves me. And Benedick basically says the same thing back. God keep your ladyship still in that mind, so some gentleman or other shall scape a predestinate scratched face. So in other words, I hope you never change your mind and start to like men, because some man's going to end up getting his face scratched. And Beatrice comes back with scratching could not make it worse, as 'twas such a face as yours. In other words, well, even if I scratched your face, it wouldn't make it worse because you're ugly. So this is just a really bit of back and forth banter that everybody would be laughing, the audience would be laughing. It's all very clever and funny. Benedick says, well, you are a rare parrot, teacher. Basically, you're like a parrot. You're copying everything I'm saying. And Beatrice said, a bird of my tongue is better than a beast of yours. In other words, well, a squawking bird is better than being a beast. And Benedick says, I would my horse had the speed of your tongue and a good continuer, but keep your way, in God's name I've done. In other words, I wish my horse was as fast and tireless as your tongue, but that's enough. Let's stop the banter. And Beatrice says, you always end with a jade's trick, I know you of old, which is a very interesting line. Suggests there's a bit of a history between these two. You always end an argument so that you can have the last word, I know you well. And then we go back to Don Pedro, who's been chatting quietly to Leonato. This is the sum of all, Leonato. Signor Claudio and Benedick, my dear friend Leonato, hath invited you all. I tell him we shall stay here at least the month, and he heartily prays some occasion may detain us longer. I dare swear he is no hypocrite, but prays from his heart. In other words, right, this is what's going to happen. We're going to stay here a month, and I'm sure he really does want us to stay. He's not just being polite. And Leonato says, if you swear, my lord, you shall not be forsworn. And then to Don John, who's the baddie of the piece, let me bid you welcome, my lord. Being reconciled to the prince your brother, I owe you all duty. So Leonato's basically saying, look, I'm serious, and saying to Don John, look, welcome. Now you've sorted out things, you're at peace with your prince, the brother. You have the same respect that I've given to Don Pedro. And this establishes, of course, a bit of a villain in the piece, which is always essential for a comedy, which we'll talk about genre in a later video. And Don John says, I thank you. I'm not a man of many words, but I thank you. In other words, well, thanks. I don't often say much, but thanks. Leonato says, please it your grace lead on. Would you please lead us all inside your grace? And Don Pedro says, your hand, Leonato, we will go together. So let's walk in together. And then everybody that's left is just Claudio and Benedick. And Claudio says, Benedick, didst thou note the daughter of Signor Leonato? In other words, did you notice Leonato's daughter? Benedick says, I noted her, but I noted her not, but I looked on her. So he's saying, well, I saw her, but I didn't notice her. Claudio says, isn't she modest? Isn't she ideal? And Benedick says, do you question me as an honest man should do for my simple true judgment, or would you have me speak after my custom as being a professed tyrant to their sex? In other words, do you want my honest opinion, or do you want me to, be specific and give my sort of special full-on criticism of her as another woman to mock, because I am known as a woman hater? And Claudio says, no, I pray thee, speak in sober judgment, tell me what you really think. Benedick says, why, in faith, methinks she's too low for a high praise, too brown for a fair praise, too little for a great praise. Only this commendation can I afford her, that were she other than she is, she were unhandsome, and being no other but she is, I do not like her. In other words, she's too short, too dark. If she wasn't so wealthy and connected, she'd be ugly. And even as she is, I don't like her. And Claudio says, thou thinkst I am in sport. I pray thee, tell me truly how thou likest her. In other words, you think I'm joking, but I'm not. Tell me, what do you think of her? Benedick says, would you buy her that you inquire after her? In other words, are you asking because you want to buy her? Claudio says, can the world buy such a jewel? Can you buy something so amazing? And so he's clearly in love. And Benedick says, yea, and a case to put it into. But speak you this with a sad brow, or do you play the flouting jack to tell us Cupid is as good hair finder and Vulcan a rare carpenter? Come, in what key shall a man take you to go in the song? In other words, yeah, you can buy a jewel and a box to put it in, but are you serious? Are you messing about and having a laugh? I need to know what you think about her. Claudio says, in mine eyes, she's the sweetest lady ever I looked on. So she's amazing. And Benedick says, well, I can see yet without spectacles, and I see no such matter. There's her cousin, as she were not possessed with a fury, exceeds as much in beauty as the 1st of May doth the last of December. But I hope you have no intent to turn husband, have you? So in other words, well, I don't have to wear glasses, but I don't see a beautiful woman. And look at her cousin, Beatrice is much more beautiful, but you can't compare them because of Beatrice's massive anger issues. But you're not thinking of getting married, are you? And Claudio says, I would scarce trust myself, though I had sworn the contrary, if Hero would be my wife. So look, I said I'd never marry, but actually, I think, if she would marry me, I would marry her. And Benedick says, is it come to this? In faith hath not the world one man, but will wear his cap with suspicion. Shall I never see a bachelor of 80 again? Go to in faith, and thou wilt need thrust thy neck into a yoke, wear thy print on it, and sigh away Sundays, look, Don Pedro is returned. So he's saying, look, is it this bad? No men now who can avoid marriage. I will never see a 60-year-old bachelor again, will I? Go ahead, put your neck in a yoke like an ox. The burden of it will scar you forever, and Sundays won't even be free. And here comes Don Pedro. So Don Pedro comes back. What secret hath held you here that you followed not Leonato? So, why didn't you follow us? And Benedick says, I would your grace would constrain me to tell. In other words, force me to tell you. And Don Pedro says, I charge thee on thy allegiance. In other words, I order you to tell me as an act of loyalty. And Benedick says, you hear, Count Claudio, I can be secret as a dumb man. I would have you think so. But on my allegiance, mark you this, on my allegiance, he is in love. With who? Now that is your grace's part. Mark how short his answer is. With Hero, Leonato's daughter. So listen, Count Claudio, I can keep secrets like a mute, I assure you, but my allegiance forces me to tell Don Pedro because I'm loyal. And then he tells Don Pedro Claudio is in love with Hero. And Claudio says, if this were so, so were it uttered. So if you say so. And Benedick says, like the old tale, my lord. It is not so, nor 'twas not so, but indeed, God forbid, it should be so. So in other words, like the old story where the defendant in a murder trial keeps denying his guilt until he's proved guilty. And Claudio says, if my passion changed not shortly, God forbid it should be otherwise. So in other words, unless my feelings change soon, I have to admit that's true. Don Pedro likes it. He says, amen, if you love her, for the lady's worthy. So that's great. If you love her, Hero is definitely worthy of your love. And Claudio says, you speak this to fetch me in? So are you just saying this to get me in? Don Pedro says, by my troth, I speak my thought. No, I'm telling you my honest opinion. And Claudio says, to that response, he says, and in faith, my lord, I spoke mine. So he's saying, well, I'm telling the truth too. And Benedick says, and by my two faiths and troths, my lord, I spoke mine. So I'm telling the truth too. And Claudio says, I love her, I feel. So I feel like I love her. And Don Pedro says that she is worthy. I know she's a worthy woman. Benedick says that I neither feel how she should be loved nor know how she should be worthy is the opinion that fire cannot melt out of me. I will die in it at the stake. In other words, I don't think she deserves to be loved, and you couldn't get that out of me with fire. Don Pedro says, thou wast ever an obstinate heretic in the despite of beauty. So you never did believe in the power of beauty. And Claudio says, and never could maintain his part but the force of his will. So it took all his willpower to stick to that view. And then Benedick says this really good bit. That a woman conceived me, I thank her. That she brought me up, I likewise give her most humble thanks. But that I will have a retreat winded in my forehead, or hang my bugle on an invisible baldric, all women shall pardon me, because I will not do them the wrong to mistrust any. I will do myself the right to trust none, and the fine is, for the which I may go the finer, I will live a bachelor. In other words, I'm grateful my mother conceived me and brought me up, but all women will have to forgive me for being unwilling to be their plaything. I won't be cheated on by a wife, because I don't want to doubt and mistrust any woman. I'll just avoid them all, live as a bachelor, and the benefit is I'll have more money for fine clothes. And Don Pedro says, I shall see thee ere I die look pale with love. In other words, before I die, I will see you in love. And Benedick says, with anger, sickness, or with hunger, my lord, not with love. Prove that ever I lose more blood with love than I will get again with drinking. Pick out my eyes with a ballad maker's pen, and hang me up at the door of a brothel house for the sign of blind Cupid. In other words, you'll see me pale with anger and with illness and with hunger, but not with love. If you can prove I'll ever be in love, I can't be brought to my senses by a night in the pub. You can pluck out my eyes with a love poet's pen and hang me up at the door of a brothel where the blind Cupid sign usually goes. Don Pedro says, well, if ever thou dost fall from this faith, thou wilt prove a notable argument. So in other words, if you ever do fall in love, I'm sure everyone would be interested in hearing those promises. And Benedick says, if I do, hang me in a bottle like a cat and shoot at me, and he that hits me, let him be clapped on the shoulder and called Adam. So in other words, If I fall in love, use me for target practice, and everyone that hits me, make them a hero. Don Pedro says, well, as time shall try, in time the savage bull doth bear the yoke. In other words, he's saying, remember that old saying, people change, essentially. Benedick says, the savage bull. But if ever the sensible Benedick bear it, pluck off the bull's horns and set them in my forehead, and let me be vilely painted, and in such great letters as they will write, here is a good horse to hire, let them signify under my sign, here you may see Benedick the married man. So he's saying, well, the savage bull might be tamed, but if you ever make me domesticated, you can put bull's horns on my head, because any wife is sure to cheat on me. You might as well hang a big sign with huge lettering around my neck saying, here's a good horse to hire. Let it say, here you may see Benedick, the married man. Claudio says, if this ever should happen, thou wouldst be horn mad. In other words, you'd go mad like a rutting buck. And Don Pedro says, nay, if Cupid have not spent all his quiver in Venice, thou will quake for this shortly. So in other words, no, I predict you'll soon be in love. Bit of foreshadowing them. Benedick says, I look for an earthquake too then. I expect an earthquake too. And Don Pedro says, well, you temporize with the hours. In the meantime, good Signor Benedick, repair to Leonato's. So what is Don Pedro saying here? He's essentially saying, well, you'll soften in time, Benedick. Meanwhile, let's go to Leonato's and tell him that we're going to be here for supper. In fact, he's saying to Benedick, you go up to Leonato, tell him I'm coming and we're going to eat with him tonight. He's making a feast. Benedick says, I have almost matter enough in me for such an embassage, and so I commit you. In other words, I think I should be able to manage that, and so I will go. And of course, Don Pedro wants to be alone with Claudio. Claudio says, to the tuition of God from my house, if I had it. And Claudio now using very elaborate imagery, which is always something Shakespeare does when someone's in love. Into God's protection from my house, if I had it. Don Pedro says, the 6th of July, your loving friend Benedick. And Benedick says, nay, mock not, the body of your discourse is sometimes guarded with fragments, and the guards are but slightly basted on neither. Ere you flout old ends, only further examine your conscience, and so I leave you. So he's basically saying, don't mock. Sometimes you two weave fragments of wit into your conversation, but it weakens rather than improves it. In other words, I'm the funny one. Before you joke about me, look long and hard at yourself, examine your conscience, and then he goes. So now Claudio and Don Pedro are alone. And Claudio says, my liege, your highness, now may do me good. And Don Pedro says, my love is thine to teach. Teach it but how, and thou shalt see how apt it is to learn any hard lesson that may do thee good. So what's happening? Claudio is saying, my lord, I'd appreciate your help with this. And Don Pedro says, look, I'm at your service. Tell me how I can help you, and I'll do my best. And no matter how difficult the favour, I'm eager to help. And Claudio then says, hath Leonato any son, my lord? Now this is always an interesting line. Has he got any sons? And you can think about that. Don Pedro says, no child but hero. She's his only heir. Dost thou affect her, Claudio? So, no, just a daughter, hero. Do you love her? And Claudio says, oh, my lord, when you went onward on this ended action, I looked upon her with a soldier's eye that liked but had a rougher task in hand than to drive liking to the name of love. But now I'm returned, and that war thoughts have left their places vacant in their rooms, come thronging soft and delicate desires, all prompting me how young and how fair young hero is, saying I liked her ere I went to wars. So in other words, Don Pedro, when we left here to go to war, I looked at her with a soldier's eye. I liked what I saw, but my attention was on violence and the battle ahead, so I couldn't allow myself to fall in love. But now that I'm back, thoughts of war have gone away, and leaving space for the soft, delicate feelings of love, which make me notice how beautiful she is and remind me why I liked her before I went to war. And then Don Pedro says, and I think this is, quite an interesting part of the play as well, thou wilt be like a lover presently, and tire the hero with a book of words. If thou dost love fair hero, cherish it, and I will break with her and with her father, and thou shalt have her. Was not to this end that thou beganst to twist so fine a story. In other words, look, you're going to be like a true lover in a minute, exhausting everyone with your stories of love. If you love her, hold on to that. I'll negotiate with her and with her father. I'll persuade Leonato to let you have Hero. And isn't that the reason you told me all of this in the first place anyway? And Claudio says, how sweetly you do minister to love, that knowest love's grief by his complexion, but lest my liking might be too sudden seem, I would have solved it with a longer treatise. So, oh, you know I am in love, you know how to care for the love's sake, but I'm worried I might seem over hasty, rushing this in my emotion. Should I explain the whole story to you and to them? And Don Pedro says, what need the bridge much broader than the flood? The fairest grant is the necessity. Look, what will serve is fit. 'Tis once thou lovest, and I will fit thee with the remedy. I know we shall have revelling tonight. I will assume thy part in some disguise, and tell fair Hero I am Claudio, and in her bosom I'll unclasp my heart, and take her hearing prisoner with the force and strong encounter of my amorous tale. Then after to her father will I break, and the conclusion is she shall be thine. In practice let it put it presently. So Don Pedro comes up with a plan, which we later know will be misused by his brother, which is, why speak longer than you have to? A bridge goes directly across even a flooded river. Whatever gets the job done is enough. Look, I only need to know that you love Hero to find a solution to your problem. Now I know we're going to have a masked ball tonight. I'll disguise myself as you, and I'll tell Hero that I'm you, and I'll pour out my loving feelings so persuasively she'll be captured by love, and then I'll negotiate with her father, and the conclusion is she'll be your wife. So let's get started right away. That's the end of Act 1, Scene 1. Now, if you found this useful, please do pick up the revision guide at mrbruff.com or on Amazon. Just £3.99 for the entire play, translation into modern English, and analysis of every scene.